On Friday, September 29, 2006, at 4:57 p.m., high above the dense Amazon jungle, 30 kilometers from the small town of Peixoto Azevedo, Brazil, something unthinkable happened. A brand new Boeing 737, carrying 154 people, simply vanished from radar. One moment it was there, flying at cruise altitude. The next? Silence. 154 people, living their lives, dreaming their dreams, all gone in an instant. The question that haunted investigators for years wasn't just what happened, but how could a modern airliner, with all its redundancy and advanced systems, fall out of the sky without a single distress call? I'm Captain James Harlow. After 28 years in commercial aviation, having flown thousands of hours in cockpits just like that one, I've learned that every accident, no matter how complex, leaves a trail of decisions, physics, and sometimes unfortunate misunderstandings. Welcome aboard. This was Gol Linhas Aéreas Flight 1907, a scheduled service from Manaus Eduardo Gomes International Airport to Brasilia Presidente Juscelino Kubitschek International Airport. For those of us who spend our lives in the air, a flight like this is routine. But this particular aircraft, a Boeing 737-800, was practically brand new. It bore the registration PR-GTD and had rolled off the assembly line that same year. Imagine buying a brand new car, driving it off the lot, and then it suddenly vanishes a week later. That's how new we're talking about here. This Boeing had only accumulated 202 total flight hours since manufacture, having completed just 162 flights. It was barely broken in, powered by reliable CFM56-7B26 engines. When an aircraft is that new, major mechanical failures are exceedingly rare. This wasn't some aging warhorse. It was the latest technology, fresh from the factory. On a Friday afternoon flight like this, the cabin was filled with people eager to get home or reach their next destination. On board Flight 1907 were 154 souls. In the left seat, commanding the aircraft, was Captain Paulo Martins, a 53-year-old veteran with over 25 years in commercial aviation, much of it flying the Boeing 737. He was known among his peers for meticulous attention to detail and a calm demeanor. Beside him in the right seat was First Officer Roberto Silva, 30 years old, a rising talent at Gol who had recently become engaged. He was newer to the 737, but eager, sharp, and highly motivated. And the passengers? These were real lives. There was Maria Clara Diaz, a 45-year-old architect traveling to Brasilia for a crucial presentation on a new urban development project, her briefcase filled with blueprints and dreams. Then there was João Mendes, a 70-year-old grandfather whose flight was a pilgrimage to see his newborn grandchild for the very first time, a small handmade wooden rattle tucked carefully into his carry-on. And Lucas Andrade, a 22-year-old university student returning to the capital after visiting family, excited to start his final year of studies, his head full of plans for the future. These were everyday people making their way across a vast country, completely unaware that their routine flight would become anything but. Everything appeared normal in the cockpit and cabin. Captain Martins and First Officer Silva completed their pre-flight checks, that familiar dance of switches, dials, and readouts, confirming the brand new Boeing 737 was ready for its journey. The weather was clear, typical for the region, offering no hint of what was coming. They departed Manaus on schedule, climbing smoothly through the warm tropical air, bound for Brasilia. Air traffic control directed them to cruise at flight level 370, 37,000 feet above sea level. This is a standard, efficient altitude for jet airliners, where the air is thin and the ride is usually smooth. The pilot set the autopilot, engaging the systems that would keep the aircraft on course and at its assigned altitude. Captain Martins might have been thinking about his quiet weekend, while First Officer Silva perhaps pictured his newly engaged fiancée. Life was proceeding as planned for everyone on board. Our airways are invisible highways in the sky, meticulously structured and controlled by air traffic controllers. Aircraft are assigned specific altitudes and routes to ensure safe separation. On this particular day, as Gol 1907 made its way eastward, another aircraft, a smaller business jet, was also flying in Brazilian airspace on a route that would eventually intersect with the Boeing's path. That's where it all went wrong. Modern airliners are equipped with TCAS, Traffic Collision Avoidance System. TCAS is designed to detect other aircraft and, if a collision risk arises, issue precise instructions to the pilots. Climb, climb, or descend, descend. It's the ultimate electronic watchdog, a last line of defense against mid-air collisions. But TCAS relies on transponders, devices on each aircraft that broadcast their position and altitude. If a transponder isn't working correctly or is configured improperly, it effectively makes the aircraft invisible to TCAS. On that Friday, the business jet's transponder was not transmitting its altitude data correctly. For reasons that would later become a major focus of the investigation, the system designed to prevent this very kind of accident was effectively blinded. Gol 1907 was flying along with its TCAS scanning the skies, but it saw no threat from the approaching jet. Air Traffic Control 2 was dealing with a complex situation. Communication issues and heavy workload created a critical breakdown in maintaining the required separation between aircraft. At 4:56 p.m., Captain Martins and First Officer Silva were flying their brand new Boeing 737, completely unaware. Maria Clara Diaz might have been reviewing her presentation notes.
João Mendes perhaps held his grandchild's rattle, a smile on his face. Lucas Andrade might have been listening to music, looking out at the endless green carpet of the Amazon below. Then, without warning, at 4:57 p.m. at flight level 370, 30 kilometers from Peixoto Azevedo, the unimaginable happened. There was a sudden, violent impact, a deafening roar. In an instant, the world inside Gol 1907 was ripped apart. The business jet, traveling in the opposite direction, struck the Boeing's left wing, tearing off a significant portion of it, including part of the engine and the horizontal stabilizer at the tail. The force of the impact was immense, like an invisible giant punching the aircraft. The business jet, despite sustaining severe damage, managed to remain airborne. Its crew, suddenly faced with a crippled aircraft and a chaotic cockpit, fought desperately to control their plane. They knew they had hit something, but they had no idea what or how bad it was for the other party. They declared an emergency and began an agonizing descent toward the nearest airfield. When the business jet landed, damaged but intact, its crew reported a mid-air collision. But for a time, no one could find the other aircraft. The Boeing had not vanished, it had been mortally wounded. Inside the cockpit, in that split second after impact, it became a scene of absolute chaos. Alarms blared, red warning lights flashed, and the aircraft lurched violently. Captain Martins and First Officer Silva were instantly fighting for control, their training kicking in even as their world disintegrated around them. The loss of a significant portion of the left wing meant the aircraft's aerodynamics were completely compromised. The mighty Boeing 737, designed for stability and strength, was now an uncontrollable projectile. The aircraft immediately entered a rapid, uncontrolled descent, spiraling downward at an incredible rate. The forces on the airframe were immense, far beyond what it was designed to withstand. Inside the cabin, the passengers experienced a sudden, terrifying plunge. Belongings flew, screams filled the air, and the cabin lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on their faces. There was nothing the pilots could do. They fought the controls, wrestling with a machine that was no longer responding, but the damage was too severe. The structural integrity of the fuselage began to fail under the extreme aerodynamic stress. Pieces of the aircraft tore away. The noise must have been deafening, a symphony of rending metal and rushing air. The aircraft broke apart in midair, scattering debris across miles of dense Amazon jungle. Then came the final, devastating impact with the unforgiving earth. A moment of unimaginable force. Then silence. Utter, absolute silence. 154 lives, extinguished in an instant, 30 kilometers from Peixoto Azevedo. In the cockpit, Captain Martins is likely monitoring instruments, First Officer Silva perhaps glancing out at the endless green below. Then, an earth-shattering impact rips through the airframe, not a bump, but a violent, bone-jarring collision. The entire plane shudders, vibrating with unnatural, terrifying intensity. The familiar hum of the engines is instantly drowned out by a deafening metallic shriek, the sound of stressed and tearing metal. Inside the cabin,
Maria Clara Diaz is perhaps adjusting her glasses, reviewing her presentation. João Mendes might be smiling at the thought of his grandchild. Lucas Andrade could be lost in thought, a song playing softly in his earbuds. Suddenly, their world tilts violently. A gut-wrenching lurch, an impossible shift in gravity. The cabin lights flicker, then some extinguish, plunging parts of the interior into disorienting gloom. Loose items become projectiles, a briefcase, a magazine, a child's toy, all hurled with brutal force. Air rushes in through newly opened breaches in the fuselage, cold and loud.
A terrifying whisper of the vacuum outside. Passengers gasp, then scream, a primal chorus of terror. In the cockpit, Captain Martin's hands instinctively tighten on the yoke. Red warning lights explode across the instrument panel, an angry constellation signaling every system failure imaginable. The master caution alarm blares, a high-pitched, insistent shriek. The flight controls go limp, then fight back with perverse resistance. The aircraft is no longer responding to their inputs in any logical way. They are flying blind, the very air they depend on now tearing their aircraft apart. The roar of the wind, the vibrations, the chaos, it's an overwhelming assault on every sense. The aircraft's nose drops violently, and the world outside the windows becomes a blur of sky and ground, spinning faster and faster. The Boeing 737, moments ago a symbol of modern engineering, is now a wounded, thrashing beast. Time is measured in fractions of a second in a situation like this. The impact was not a glancing blow, it was a devastating amputation of a critical flight surface. The left wing, a primary lifting and control surface, was severely compromised. Without symmetric lift and control, especially at cruise speed and altitude, an aircraft instantly becomes unstable. The aerodynamic forces acting on the damaged Boeing were immense and uncontrollable. Captain Martins and First Officer Silva would have reacted instantaneously. Their muscle memory, honed over thousands of hours, would have taken over. They would have scanned the instruments, tried to analyze the sudden cascade of failures, and attempted to counteract the aircraft's violent motions. They would have pulled on the yokes, pushed on the rudders, trying every trick in the book to restore some semblance of control. But the physics were stacked against them. With a significant portion of the wing gone, the aircraft was fundamentally broken. It was like trying to steer a car that had just lost a wheel at highway speeds. The control surfaces that remained simply lacked the authority to command the aircraft. Its fundamental ability to fly was destroyed in that single, brutal moment. There was no time for a distress call, no time for a mayday. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sounds of the jungle. For those on the ground, miles from the crash site, there was nothing. The business jet, damaged but able to limp to a safe landing, confirmed a mid-air collision, but the search for the other aircraft began in earnest, a desperate race against time and fading daylight. Search and rescue teams, comprising both military and civilian personnel, were immediately mobilized. The vastness and density of the Amazon rainforest presented an enormous challenge. Imagine trying to find a needle in a haystack, where the haystack is hundreds of square miles of impenetrable jungle canopy. Hours turned into agonizing days. The initial hope, however faint, of finding survivors slowly evaporated as the full scale of the debris field became apparent. It was scattered over a wide area, testament to the immense forces that tore the aircraft apart in midair. The scene, once located, was one of utter devastation. There were no survivors. The 154 souls on board, including Captain Paulo Martins, First Officer Roberto Silva, Maria Clara Diaz, João Mendes, and Lucas Andrade, perished instantly. The task of recovery was grim, painstaking, and emotionally crushing for everyone involved. News of the accident quickly reached the families waiting in Brasilia, turning anticipation into unimaginable grief. The Brazilian Air Force's Accident Investigation and Prevention Center, CINIPA, immediately launched its formal investigation, designated A-00X/CINIPA/2008, beginning the long process of piecing together the final moments of Gol 1907. They had to understand not just what happened, but why, to prevent such a tragedy from ever happening again. The CINIPA investigation, designated A-00X/CENIPA/2008 was exhaustive. They didn't just look for what broke, they meticulously examined every decision, every missed communication, and every piece of equipment involved. For those of us who have spent decades in this environment, analyzing these reports is like reading a tragic textbook. The causes of this accident weren't simple, but they converged into a deadly scenario that nobody anticipated. First and foremost was the fundamental technical breakdown. The business jet's transponder failed to correctly transmit its altitude information. A transponder is like an aircraft's digital voice in the sky. It broadcasts your identity, speed, and most importantly, your altitude to air traffic control and to other aircraft equipped with TCAS. Without that altitude information being transmitted, both the ground controllers and the Boeing's own collision avoidance system were essentially blind to the business jet's true position in the vertical plane. The investigation strongly suggested that the transponder on the business jet was inadvertently switched to a standby mode, or a mode that simply did not transmit altitude data to external systems. When the altitude information vanished, the Boeing's sophisticated TCAS system, which relies on that data from other aircraft, had no information to compute a potential collision course. It couldn't warn the Gol crew because, to its sensors, the business jet effectively wasn't there. This single operational lapse created an invisible, fast-moving threat. Second, the air traffic control system itself demonstrated significant vulnerabilities. A TC's primary responsibility is to ensure safe separation between aircraft. In this case, there was a breakdown in that fundamental duty. The controllers were operating under heavy workload, and the investigation revealed issues with controller training, equipment limitations, and a general lack of effective procedures for managing traffic when data was incomplete.
When the business jet's transponder ceased transmitting altitude, the controllers were left with only what we call primary radar returns, essentially just a blip on the screen, indicating an aircraft's presence and lateral position, but critically, no height information. It's like seeing a dot move across a map without knowing if it's on the ground or at 37,000 feet. This made it nearly impossible for them to assess the potential for a mid-air conflict. The investigation highlighted that the system for handing off aircraft between different control sectors was prone to errors, particularly when one aircraft was not reporting correctly. Controllers working these sectors were dealing with known equipment issues and heavy workloads, which contributed to a fragmented picture of the airspace. Aviation relies on clear, constant communication and precise data. When these elements are absent or degraded, the system's ability to prevent two aircraft from occupying the same piece of sky at the same time is severely compromised. Third, and crucial when we talk about human factors, was the lack of proper crew resource management and situational awareness within the cockpit of the business jet. While the Gol crew was flying their assigned altitude, unaware of any danger, the business jet pilots had a fundamental responsibility to ensure their aircraft was properly configured and that they were actively monitoring their systems and surroundings. The investigation suggested that they may have been distracted, perhaps by familiarizing themselves with a new avionics suite, or simply not maintaining the rigorous cockpit scan and radio monitoring that every professional pilot is trained to uphold. They were cleared to fly at a different altitude and should have been maintaining it or explicitly coordinating any changes with air traffic control. This isn't about blaming individuals for the final impact,
but about understanding how their operational choices and adherence to basic procedures contributed to putting them in that deadly position. In the cockpit, vigilance is the bedrock of safety. When these fundamental responsibilities are not met, the consequences can be truly devastating. These three factors, acting in concert, created a chain of events that proved impossible to break. That's where it all went wrong for Gol Linhas Aéreas Flight 1907. The investigation by CENIPA, documented in Report A-00X/CENIPA/2008, concluded that the primary cause was the mid-air collision between Gol 1907 and the business jet, exacerbated by the business jet's transponder not transmitting altitude data. This made it essentially invisible to the Boeing's TCAS and difficult for air traffic control to monitor its vertical position.
The report also highlighted significant deficiencies in the air traffic control system, including inadequate equipment, heavy controller workload, and communication failures, which prevented effective separation of the two aircraft. In aviation, this wasn't a single point of failure. It was a chain, where each link weakened the system until it finally broke. This accident, along with others, prompted a significant overhaul of Brazilian airspace management. A key outcome was the creation of the Integrated Airspace Management System, Sistema Integrado de Gestão do Espaço Aéreo, SIGEA, implemented in 2008. This system aimed to improve communication, modernize equipment, and standardize procedures for both pilots and air traffic controllers, especially regarding transponder operation and the handling of non-transmitting aircraft. The incident led to more stringent requirements for pilot training on transponder use and monitoring, emphasizing their critical role in collision avoidance. The enhancements to air traffic control, the mandatory updates to transponder protocols,
and the renewed emphasis on vigilance in the cockpit have undoubtedly prevented countless potential mid-air incidents. Every pilot now understands the absolute necessity of an active and correctly configured transponder, and controllers have better tools and training to manage complex airspace. These changes have protected thousands of lives over the past 18 years. The 154 souls aboard Gol 1907 became an enduring lesson in the complexities of aviation safety, ensuring future flights would be safer because of what happened on that Friday. You have to understand, we're taught from day one that the transponder is your digital voice. If you were in the cockpit of that business jet, perhaps having just familiarized yourself with new equipment, do you believe the operational lapse with the transponder was an understandable mistake under the circumstances, or a critical failure of fundamental procedure? Let me know what you think in the comments below. These stories are never easy to tell, but they're vital. They teach us, they make aviation safer, and they honor the memories of those we lost. If you find value in these detailed insider investigations, please consider giving this video a like. It's free, takes just 2 seconds, and it genuinely helps this independent channel reach more people who care about aviation as much as we do. If you want to keep diving deep into these cases with me, think about subscribing or even becoming a member. Your support makes it possible for me to bring these stories to you without external influence or sensationalism. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that transponder question in the comments. Your perspective, as fellow aviation enthusiasts, is what truly makes this community special.